America mobilized quickly. We took the army from about 200,000 men to 3 million in just a few months. We gave our men some training, but not much, and we rushed them over to Europe to go right into the trenches in France as quickly as possible. We begin to get there in late 1917, and our doughboys show up. So-called doughboys, because they were willing to fight for the dough, which is another term for money, show up in the trenches, and the English and the French are in there, filthy, sick, coughing, low on everything, exhausted, and our guys show up fresh. Well, on the other side of no man's land, the Germans have nobody showing up to help them. Now, I told you the Germans are going to launch a final all-out offensive. That's why they broke the Sussex Pledge. And their final bet is this big all-out offensive. Well, they bet wrong. They bet wrong. And the United States, along with the British and the French, are going to stop the German onslaught and start pushing the Germans out of their trenches back towards Germany. And by the spring and summer of 1918, Americans are in the breach, in the forefront of pushing the Germans back towards Germany. America really supported this war. There was a draft, very little resistance, because Americans believed what Woodrow Wilson was promising, that this is the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy. We used propaganda, and Americans were really behind this war because Woodrow Wilson explained it in simple terms. The war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy. We did some silly things in terms of propaganda. We started to call Frankfurters hot dogs. That's how we got the name hot dog. We didn't want to use the German word Frankfurter, hot dog. And we tried to change sauerkraut to Liberty cabbage, but that didn't catch on, but hot dog caught on. And Americans were urged to save food, because the food was needed for our troops and to send aid to Belgium. And we sold bonds to raise money for the war. Everybody got behind it. And the best way for me to explain this is American troops showed up in the trenches on the Western Front in the nick of time, like a movie. And we're right there, and in some cases in the lead, as the Germans are pushed back towards Germany. Finally, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the word goes out all quiet on the Western Front. The Germans surrendered. They surrendered so that they would not be forced to allow the Allies into Germany. They surrendered. They knew they were beaten. Kaiser Wilhelm quit, abdicated his throne, goes into exile, and the Germans are defeated in the Great War, which we now call World War I. All right, that's information you need to know. So, America is a hero. Wilson is a hero. And here is where you pick up part 2 of your paper. This is where don't talk about the war. I just told you about the war. You can read more about the war. But the war is over, and part 2 is about the diplomacy, the foreign policy after the war. All right, here we go. Part 2 of your paper. Now, even before the war was over, Woodrow Wilson made a big speech before Congress that goes down in history as the 14-point speech. And obviously there are 14 points in it. He has a dream for what the world will be like after the war. And he's telling the world, he's telling Americans and the world, this is why we're fighting. And he really believed in his dream. He really did want to make it the war to end all wars. The first point he made was we should have open treaties, no more entangling alliances, where if 2 countries start fighting, the rest of Europe just gets dragged into it. All right, open treaties. Freedom of the seas. Anybody should be able to trade with any country at any time. All right, let's not have submarines sinking unarmed merchant ships. Freedom of the seas, international free trade. Let's get rid of these tariffs that we talked about that make nations so tense with each other. and so sometimes resentful of each other. International free trade, reduction of armaments. Let's reduce the size of our armies and our navies so that we're less likely to get into war. He's way ahead of his time on that score. And settlement of colonial claims in the interest of the native peoples. All right, he's saying to the Europeans in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, let the native peoples have their own countries. The age of colonization is over, Wilson's trying to tell the Europeans. And 6 through 13, adjustment of European boundaries to benefit separate nationalities. Let's have different nationalities have their own country, for goodness sake. Like Hungarians in Hungary, or Poles in a country called Poland that didn't exist because it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is an attempt to calm everybody down now that the empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary are being broken up. Now, point 14. Point 14. Wilson's idea, Wilson's biggest idea, his idea of a lifetime. Creation of the League of Nations. Creation of the League of Nations. An international organization where all the countries of the world are going to join. And they'll meet and they'll discuss their problems and their issues and they'll settle them before going to war and killing millions of people. That's what the League of Nations is supposed to be, and it's Wilson's idea. What Wilson says he wants is peace without victory. He wants the war to end and everybody to come out better on the other side. He doesn't want Germany harshly punished. He wants a better world after World War I is over. That's his dream. That is his dream. Now, when the war is over, Wilson decides, big deal at the time, to go to Paris for the peace conference. The first time an American president has ever left the country during a term in office. Not a big deal now. The president flies everywhere on Air Force One. A big, huge deal back then. And Wilson decides that he's going to go to Paris and negotiate with the Secretary of State by his side, Secretary of State Lansing, negotiate the peace treaty everybody's going to sign after World War I. He's going to do it himself. He's going to go to the Paris Peace Conference. But he starts to make some mistakes. In the 1918 midterm election, when 1/3 of the Senate is running for re-election and the entire House of Representatives is running, Wilson makes a mistake and tells the American people, vote for Democrats because that's my party and the Democrats will support me more as I negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty at the Paris Peace Conference. Well, the American people were offended by that because the American people thought this was a moral crusade. And here was Wilson making politics out of it. And what Wilson said backfired because in the midterm election of 1918, they sent majorities of Republicans to control the House of Representatives and the Senate. And remember, Wilson is a Democrat now going overseas to negotiate for the United States at the Paris Peace Conference. And he goes to the Paris Peace Conference, notably not taking the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, the guy he needs to help get the treaty approved by the Senate when Wilson negotiates it in Paris and brings it back home to the United States. So he makes an enemy out of somebody he needs to be friends with, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Republican of Massachusetts, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. All right, so Wilson, on his high horse, the United States showed up in the nick of time to help win the war for the Allies, really turn the tide. And he shows up, and when he gets to Paris, he runs into a buzzsaw. And the buzzsaw are the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George, the Premier of France, George Clemenceau, and Vittorio Orlando, the leader, the Premier of Italy. Along with Wilson, these four leaders are in control at the Paris Peace Conference. They're known as the Big Four. And Wilson wants his 14 points. And Wilson wants peace without victory. But especially Lloyd George and Clemenceau, they want peace with victory. They want revenge. They want vengeance. They've been fighting this war since 1914. They've lost many, many more men than the United States has. They want revenge. And Wilson will negotiate like crazy, as hard as he can, in Paris, and does the best he can. But what comes out of the Paris Peace Conference is called the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles. And it's not really what Wilson wanted. It's harsh. Germany is punished very, very harshly. Germany is forced to pay damages for the war. Far more damages than they could afford to pay, wrecking their economy for the 1920s. Germany is humiliated by being forced to sign a war guilt clause, taking the blame for the war. I think they deserve most of the blame for the war, but what was the point of humiliating an entire country? But they did. What comes out is peace with victory, a harsh treaty that punishes Germany. A very harsh treaty. And Woodrow Wilson does get one thing in the treaty. They include in the treaty the creation of the League of Nations. They will create the League of Nations. It's Wilson's idea. So he comes back to the United States. He's got the treaty that includes his idea, the League of Nations, and he's got to get it, as you darn well know, we've talked about it in class, he's got to get it approved by the Senate. That is where you end part 2 of your paper. Part 2 of your paper is about Wilson, his 14 points, his dream of peace without victory, a world without war after World War I, going to the Paris Peace Conference, running into a buzzsaw, doing the best he can, but what comes out is a very harsh treaty in which Germany is punished, has to pay reparations, and humiliate itself by signing a war guilt clause. But at least he gets the League of Nations, and he comes home and he's got the treaty, and he's going to get it approved by the Senate. End of part 2 of your paper.